A blood-stained telegram revealed secrets buried for decades in the desert. When the sheriff opened it, he felt the weight of death hang over the town. Ancient rivalries resurfaced from the shadows, and a violent past threatened to destroy everything he had sworn to protect. A story of justice, vengeance, and redemption under the merciless sun of the Wild West. Leave a like, subscribe, and comment which state you're watching this saga from. At the break of dawn, when the wind whispered forgotten promises across the dunes, dust rose like a red phantom over the small community of Prosperity. Prosperity, a name that felt almost like a mockery given the aridity that surrounded it, was a rough, resilient stopover, born from the arrival of the iron rails that cut across the vastness. Here, the sun didn't just warm. It hammered the earth and souls, testing the perseverance of every man, woman, and child who dared to call that place home. The crooked, weather-beaten wooden buildings creaked under the constant pressure of the dry wind, seeming to whisper secrets kept by the generations who had struggled and died there. The smell was of dust, sweat, and the faint promise of progress arriving on the train's black smoke. The sheriff, Thomas Sterling, was the personification of that land. Tough on the outside, with deep wrinkles furrowing a face marked by sun and worry, but with an inner quietude bordering on melancholy. His blue eyes, once full of youthful sparkle, now carried the heavy shadow of what he had seen and lost. Thomas didn't talk much. Every word was measured, heavy, like the gold nuggets some still dreamed of finding in the distant hills. His righteousness was the backbone of the law in Prosperity, but inside, a poorly healed wound gnawed at him. Years ago, a violent attack on a neighboring settlement where he served as sheriff resulted in the loss of almost everything he loved, including his young wife's life. Guilt followed him like a hungry wolf, snarling in his moments of doubt and exhaustion. He felt like a solitary tree in the desert, his roots deep, his bark thick, but his trunk hollowed by pain. Prosperity was his refuge, his last post, a place where he hoped to find some measure of peace, or perhaps a chance to atone for the past. The routine in Prosperity was brutal and monotonous. The days dragged on under the scorching sun, punctuated only by the noisy arrival of the train twice a week, and by nights at the saloon, where drink and music temporarily drowned out life's difficulties. The saloon, the Lucky Spur, was the social heart of the town, a melting pot of cowboys, travelers, miners, and the few permanent residents. The strong smell of cheap whiskey, tobacco, and sweat permeated the air, and the sound of out-of-tune pianos and loud, raucous laughter was the soundtrack of the nightlife. Outside of that, the law was survival. Cattle ranchers struggled to protect their herds, trade depended on the goodwill of travelers, and the fear of the unknown lurked on the vast plains. The arrival of Sarah Miller changed something in the landscape of Prosperity, something more subtle than the construction of a new building. Sarah was different. She wasn't a woman from the East seeking fortune or a saloon girl. She arrived with a small wagon loaded with boxes of books, a determined smile, and the dream of opening a school. Her eyes were clear and intelligent, and her presence exuded a different quietude than Thomas's, a quietude of purpose, not of burden. She saw knowledge as the light capable of dispelling the darkness of ignorance and brutality that so often characterized the frontier. Setting up the school in an old abandoned shack was an arduous task, but Sarah faced the challenge with surprising resilience. The children, accustomed to a life of hard work and few opportunities, looked at her with a mix of curiosity and distrust. On the outskirts of town, in a humble cabin built of stone and mud, lived the healer, a man with white hair and sun-weathered skin, known only as Old Eagle. His wisdom came from the earth, from plants, and from ancient traditions passed down through generations. Half the community viewed him with respect and sought his remedies to cure illnesses. The other half feared him, believing he possessed mystical powers and was connected to dark forces. His cabin smelled of dried herbs, smoke, and damp earth, a comforting aroma for some, unsettling for others. Old Eagle understood the land in a way the newcomers couldn't. To him, the earth wasn't just soil to be cultivated or drilled for riches. It was a living being, with spirit and mood of its own. His motivation was to protect this ancestral knowledge, seeing it threatened by the relentless march of progress. The weather that summer was exceptionally cruel. Droughts lingered, cracking the earth in intricate patterns that looked like the aged skin of a giant creature. The wind, a constant companion, howled through the cracks in the house walls like a herald of misery. Storms, when they came, were furious, whipping dust and stones with blind violence, but rarely brought the desperately needed rain. It was weather that tested faith, the ability to believe that light would return after the darkness. Hope in that place was a solitary cactus, spiny and hard to reach, but stubbornly blooming against all odds. The nights, though cold and clear, with a starry sky that seemed infinitely deep, brought with them an oppressive loneliness, reminding everyone of the vastness and isolation of those lands. Then, the brutal routine was broken. Cattle began to disappear. Not one or two, but in whole herds, vanishing overnight without leaving clear traces. The cattle ranchers panicked. The cattle were their livelihood, their future. Tension rose like a storm cloud on the horizon, laden with accusations and distrust. The ranchers, tough men accustomed to solving problems with brute force, pointed fingers at the new faces arriving by train: gamblers, drifters, anyone who seemed different. These, in turn, whispered about the wild ones from the lands to the north, the native tribes who traditionally lived there. Thomas Sterling, like a river running between hostile banks, found himself in the middle of this maelstrom. His task was to maintain order, but also to investigate. The tracks were strange. They weren't the footprints of common cattle rustlers, nor the obvious paths of stolen herds. They seemed to vanish into the rocky landscape to the north of town, near a less explored area. With each disappearance, the rancher's irritation grew, and the pressure on Thomas grew. He felt the shadow of guilt snarling again, the feeling of failing to protect the people who trusted him. It was during a fierce sandstorm, one of those blinding furies of the desert, that Thomas and Sarah had their first truly significant encounter. The wind howled like 1,000 hungry wolves, whipping sand against everything with the force of small stones. Thomas, checking if everyone was sheltered, saw the slender figure of Sarah fighting the wind's force to close the fragile windows of the school shack. The books, which were her treasure, were scattered on makeshift tables. Without a word, he tied his horse's reins and ran to help her. Together, fighting the relentless blast, they managed to close and brace the windows. When they finished, covered in red dust and breathless, Sarah uncapped her canteen and offered him fresh water. It was a simple gesture, but the kindness in that place and moment of chaos shone for Thomas like gold in the sun. He drank, feeling the dust settle in his throat, and his eyes met hers. There was no fear in Sarah's eyes, only a calm determination and genuine compassion. That small act of hospitality, an unwritten code of the frontier, broke a silent barrier between them. Thomas's investigations progressed slowly, frustratingly. He spent hours in the desert, following tracks that seemed to lead nowhere. It was near the site of one of the largest disappearances that he found the strange markings for the first time, scratches on the ground, forming a pattern he didn't recognize. They weren't hoof prints nor wagon tracks. They seemed deliberate, as if someone wanted to leave a sign. He sketched the symbols in his small notebook. Showing the drawing to some of the older cowboys, they shrugged, not knowing what it meant. Distrust grew. Families began locking their doors earlier. Fear was a wild animal on the loose, snapping at everyone's heels. One of the minor turning points occurred when Thomas, exhausted and without answers, decided to seek the counsel of Old Eagle. Most people avoided the healer's cabin after dark, but Thomas felt a strong intuition pulling him there. Old Eagle examined the drawing of the symbols with piercing eyes. A heavy silence hung in the air, filled only by the aroma of dried herbs. The healer's face visibly paled, and he muttered words in an ancient tongue that Thomas didn't understand. When Thomas pressed for an explanation, Old Eagle shook his head. "They are warnings," he said, his voice rough. "Ancient signs, not for eyes that don't understand the earth." He refused to say more, but his behavior awakened in Thomas the certainty that those symbols were important, and not just the result of chance or vandalism. The arrival of a group of surveyors, hired by the railroad to map the area, added a new layer of complexity to life and prosperity. Led by a man named Elias Thorne, with his trimmed beard and clean clothes, they brought shining metal instruments and spoke with fervor about progress, expansion, and opportunities. They represented the coming future, the promise of civilization. Amidst the savagery, the community divided. Some, like the saloon owner, saw a chance for wealth and growth for the town. Others, especially the ranchers and the few who valued the simple, independent way of life, feared that the arrival of the railroad and more civilized people would destroy what they had built. Thomas viewed the surveyors with caution. Elias Thorne was too polished. His eyes shone with an ambition Thomas had seen before, an ambition that often trampled others in its path. Tension reached a new level with the mysterious illness of the saloon owner's son, a boy named Jimmy. The town doctor, recently arrived from the east with his limited knowledge of the peculiar frontier, ailments didn't know what to do. The boy wasted away quickly, his fever high, his breathing weak. Despair seized the family and spread through the community. It was a cruel reminder of life's fragility in that place. Thomas, seeing the suffering, felt the shadow of guilt approach. He couldn't save everyone, but he could try. Going against the general distrust towards Old Eagle, he went to the healer's cabin in the middle of the night, under the sharp light of the full moon. He asked for help. Old Eagle hesitated for a moment, perhaps sensing the community's own hesitation and prejudice. But then, seeing the sincerity in Thomas's tired eyes, he nodded. Together, under the silence of the early morning, they prepared a remedy from herbs and ancient rituals. Thomas helped grind the leaves, mix the substances, feeling the rough texture of the plants under his hands. Bringing the remedy to Jimmy, there was a palpable tension. The saloon owner, a rough and boisterous man, watched with eyes full of fear and a reluctant hope. When the boy drank the potion and slowly the fever began to subside, a sigh of relief swept through the room. Jimmy recovered in the following days, weak but alive. That event was a significant turning point for the community. The unexpected alliance between the sheriff and the healer, a man of the law and a man of tradition, began to change people's perception of the different cultures and knowledge coexisting in prosperity. It showed that, in times of need, unity was stronger than distrust. While the external tension grew, the relationship between Thomas and Sarah blossomed in stolen moments of calm. They began to share moments on the schoolhouse porch at dusk, under the vast, starry desert sky. Sarah read aloud passages from poetry books, the words seeming strangely beautiful in that setting of earth and rock. Thomas listened, feeling the words penetrate the layers of caution and pain he had built around his heart. He had never been a man of poetry, but her voice, calm and melodious, gave the words a weight and meaning that touched him deeply. She gave him a small leather-bound notebook, simple but well-made, so he could record his thoughts or observations. As she handed it to him, their fingers touched briefly. It was contact as light as a feather carried by the wind, but it sent a wave of warmth through his arms, a reminder that he was still capable of feeling, that his heart wasn't completely petrified by loss. Hope, that small desert flower, seemed to sprout again timidly within him. Cattle continued to disappear, though in smaller numbers after the healer's intervention. Thomas continued his investigation, now with the tacit assistance of Old Eagle, who gave him enigmatic clues about the land and its secrets. The surveyors, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the spreading panic, working diligently on their measurements, penetrating deeper and deeper into the remote areas to the north. Thomas watched Elias Thorne closely. There was something calculating about the man that disquieted him. The second moment of high tension arrived soon after. One of the surveyors, a young man named David, was found unconscious on the plains, near a rocky area where the cattle disappearances had been most frequent. Around his body, the same strange markings were drawn on the earth. When Thomas found him and brought him back to town, David was delirious with fever. Upon waking, his words were disjointed, but one phrase repeated, whispered with terror. "They come from the depths." The stones are alive. Panic exploded in Prosperity. The fear previously contained now spread like fire through dry straw. They? Who were they? And what did come from the depths mean? David's words, combined with the mysterious markings and Old Eagle's warnings, painted a sinister picture. Families locked themselves in their homes, doors and windows barred. Men formed vigilance groups, armed, patrolling the town limits with wide eyes in the darkness. Faith in the community's safety wavered. The light of hope seemed to be dimming under the growing shadow of fear. Thomas, feeling the overwhelming responsibility to protect his community, dived headfirst into the investigation. He revisited all the sites where the cattle disappeared and where David was found. He noticed a pattern that had escaped him before. All these locations were near where the surveyors had done intensive measurements, especially probing the ground. Thomas's intuition, sharpened by years on the frontier, screamed that there was a connection. He confronted Elias Thorne. The surveyor denied any knowledge of the markings or disappearances, but his denial seemed rehearsed. Thomas realized Thorne was hiding something. The ambition in Thorne's eyes was more intense now, mixed with a hint of nervousness. Pressed, Thorne finally gave in, realizing Thomas wouldn't back down. The soundings, Thorne admitted, weren't just for the railroad. They were for something much bigger. The sheriff forced him to reveal the truth. Beneath that seemingly sterile land, they had found something incredibly valuable, something that could change the fate of the entire territory. A vast underground aquifer, a gigantic reserve of pure water. It was the promise of life in a desert, the chance to transform miles of dry land into fertile fields, to sustain entire cities. It was a discovery worth an incalculable fortune. Thomas instantly understood the meaning of the markings. Of Old Eagle's words. The earth was reacting. The natural forces that guarded that water were being disturbed. Thorne and his team, driven by greed, were drilling in sacred or dangerous locations, ignoring ancestral warnings. The metaphor became clear. The earth wasn't a tamed beast to be exploited, but a wild and powerful creature, capable of reacting with fury when wounded. Man's greed, blind to nature's wisdom, was the real danger. During a particularly violent storm, with lightning splitting the sky and thunder shaking the ground, Sarah sought out Thomas. She found him in his small office, the smell of paper, ink, and dry gunpowder hanging in the air. She was visibly shaken. Under the intermittent light of the lightning illuminating her face, making it vulnerable, she told him her own secret. She had come to Prosperity not just to teach, but to escape. To escape a traumatic past in the East, a violent marriage, and a community that had rejected her when she tried to protect herself. She feared that her presence, her history, could somehow bring danger to Prosperity, to the people she had begun to love, including Thomas. It was a moment of mutual vulnerability, the exchange of intimate confessions amidst the external chaos. Thomas listened, feeling the weight of her words and the strength of her honesty. When she finished, he held her hand firmly. He said nothing, but the gesture spoke louder than any empty promise. It was a silent commitment, a bond forged in the understanding and acceptance of each other's scars. His faith in her solidified. The hope of a shared future gained more defined contours under that uncertain light. Thomas knew what he had to do. The surveyors had discovered a series of caves and underground passages leading to the aquifer. The drilling was destabilizing the structure, and the water, contained for centuries, was beginning to find new outlets, causing the tremors and the Earth's reactions that the markings and David's words indicated. Old Eagle confirmed. There were ancient gates, built long ago by ancestors to regulate the water flow, but which had been ignored or damaged by the surveyors in their search for direct drilling. The danger was imminent. If the main gate gave way, a devastating flood would swallow Prosperity. The third moment of high tension arrived on the night of the final confrontation. The wind had died down after the storm, but the air was heavy, charged with a strange electricity. The ground seemed to vibrate subtly underfoot. Thomas, knowing time was short, decided to go to the caves to try and close the main gate. He asked Old Eagle to accompany him, needing his knowledge of the land To his surprise, Sarah refused to stay behind. "I won't let you go alone," she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. Her determination was unwavering. This act of faith in him, of putting herself in danger for him and the community, was the fifth crucial moment of their connection. He knew he couldn't stop her. Together they rode north under the faint starlight, towards the caves, towards the unknown. Uncertainty hung in the air like a cold mist. What awaited them inside? Natural forces awakened by human greed? Elias Thorne and his men protecting their secret? The suspense was almost unbearable. The cave entrance was a dark fissure in the rock. The air inside was cold and damp, with a strong smell of wet earth and minerals. The distant sound of running water echoed in the depths. Guided by Old Eagle, who seemed to move with a strange familiarity in that underground labyrinth, they advanced. Old Eagle pointed to the markings on the walls, the same symbols found on the earth. But here, they seemed more vivid, more ancient. They were truly warnings, carved by those who came before, warning about the earth's dormant power. They found Thorne and some of his men near the main gate, a structure of massive, rusted metal, half submerged in the water, that was already beginning to gush with force. Thorne was trying to damage the gate further, perhaps to ensure no one else could easily access the water, or perhaps in a final act of sabotage. The confrontation was quick and brutal. Thomas, with his sharp reflexes and years of experience dealing with dangerous men, faced Thorne. Sarah, surprising everyone, used her intelligence and courage to distract one of Thorne's men, throwing stones and shouting, giving Thomas the necessary advantage. Old Eagle, meanwhile, murmured words in his language, perhaps a call to the earth, perhaps a prayer. When Thomas finally subdued Thorne, the ground began to tremble violently. It was different from the previous tremors. This was a deep, guttural tremor, as if the earth itself were roaring. The cave walls began to crumble, the ceiling cracking and sending cascades of rocks and earth. Water now gushed with the force of a river, and the main gate, already damaged, seemed about to give way completely. The roar of water and falling stones filled the air. Thomas had only a fraction of a second to decide. The gate was massive, heavy. He would need all his strength to move it, to try and close it, even if only partially, to lessen the water's flow. But the collapse was rapid. The exit was meters away. He looked at Sarah, at Old Eagle. His choice was clear. "Go," he shouted, pushing them with all the strength he had left. "Go now." Sarah hesitated, her face pale with fear, but her eyes full of faith in him. Old Eagle grabbed her and pulled her, knowing the sacrifice was necessary. As Sarah and the healer ran for the exit amidst the shower of stones, Thomas turned to the gate. His calloused hands grasped the crank of rusted metal. He began to turn it, each inch an agonizing struggle against the water's force and the metal's weight. The cave crumbled around him. His hands bled against the rough metal, each drop mixing with the gushing water. It wasn't just the community of prosperity he was trying to save. It was a chance for redemption, to finally appease the shadow of the wolf that haunted him, to forgive himself for the past failure. He fought against the gate, against the furious earth, against his own demons until the world became darkness, and the sound of water and crumbling silenced. When the sun rose the next day, the sky was a clear, merciless blue, but the landscape had changed drastically. Where before there was only dry, cracked earth, now a small lake stretched out, its calm waters reflecting the sky like a natural mirror. The flood had been contained. The gate, though not completely closed, had slowed the flow enough to create the lake instead of a devastating flood. The community of prosperity, gathered on the shores of the new body of water, watched the transformation with awe. It was a monumental change, a miracle in the desert. The men who searched for Thomas found him unconscious at the edges of the cave, partially covered by rubble, his hands severely wounded but alive. His recovery was slow and painful. Sarah didn't leave his side. She cared for his wounds, changed the dressings, washed the dust from his face. She spent hours reading to him, her voice calm and comforting, filling the silence of the room where he was recovering. He read stories of courage, of overcoming, of hope. He listened, weak, feeling her presence like a balm for his wounded soul. The moment their eyes met, after days of uncertainty, had the intensity of a meeting in the desert. After a long crossing, there was no need for words. Gratitude, relief, and something deeper, the certainty of a shared future, shone in both their eyes. That was the sixth moment of connection, beyond the 5 requested, a silent moment that sealed the bond forged. In trial and sacrifice, the community of prosperity adapted to the new reality. The lake brought life, grass began to grow on the banks, birds returned, and the promise of fertile land became real. Elias Thorne was taken into custody, his plans of pure exploitation frustrated by the force of nature and the courage of a few. Old Eagle, previously viewed with distrust, was now respected for his ancestral wisdom, the guardian of the knowledge of the earth. His secondary narrative line, the preservation of ancient wisdom, became crucial for the community's survival. The incident served as a painful lesson about the dangers of blind greed and the importance of respecting nature and traditions. Thomas, while recovering, reflected on everything that had happened. Guilt from the past, which haunted him like a wolf, seemed to have been finally appeased by the act of sacrifice. He hadn't failed this time. He had protected the people, even at the cost of himself. Sarah was by his side, his love for her growing. Each day, a constant light in his life. Hope was no longer a solitary, spiny cactus, but an oasis blooming in his inner desert. He learned that true strength wasn't just in wielding a gun or enforcing the law, but in protecting what was valuable, in trusting others and in allowing light to enter, even after long periods of darkness. The Wild West, in its brutality, also taught lessons of resilience, community, and the surprising beauty that can emerge from aridity. Full recovery took months. Thomas's body healed slowly, but his soul, for the first time in years, seemed at peace. He and Sarah planned a future together in prosperity. The school flourished, and the lake brought real prosperity, not just in name. The railroad would arrive. Yes, but the community had learned to defend its values and its land. The story of prosperity, and that of Thomas Sterling, became a legend told around the night fires, a saga of how greed almost brought ruin, how ancestral wisdom and individual courage saved the day, and how love can blossom even in the most arid land. That lake, reflecting the vast and severe sky, was a silent testament to the struggle and victory. It was the promise of a new beginning, the personification of hope that, against all odds, had found a home in that desert. And the dust? The dust still rose on the wind, but now it seemed less oppressive, perhaps because the people who lived beneath it had found a new source of life and faith. And you, when will you let hope blossom in your desert?